June 1944. The Philippine Sea. High above the rolling expanse of blue water, Japan's finest aviators are flying toward what they believe will be another victory. Their formation cuts across the clouds. Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima torpedo bombers glinting under the morning sun, but far beyond their sight, something unseen is already watching them. On the decks of American carriers, radar antennas rotate slowly, metal sentinels sweeping the sky with invisible waves. Operators in dim-lit rooms trace faint green blips moving closer and closer. In seconds, coded messages ripple through the fleet. Fighter squadrons launch before the enemy is even visible. When the Japanese pilots finally glimpse the horizon, it's too late. Hellcats are already above them, waiting. The Pacific's skies have changed forever. And for Japan's proud airmen, this day will mark the moment they realize the Pacific was no longer theirs. At the beginning of the Pacific War, the skies belonged to Japan. From Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the thunderous victories across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese naval aviation was unmatched. Their carrier pilots were the best trained in the world, graduates of an elite system built on precision, discipline, and sacrifice. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was a marvel of range and agility, light enough to outmaneuver anything America could field in 1942. When they struck with devastating surprise. But what Japan's aviators didn't know was that their greatest weapon, surprise, had an expiration date. As early as 1942, deep within America's naval laboratories and remote island bases, something new was being born. Radar, radio detection, and ranging. At first, it was crude, experimental, fragile. But by 1943, it had become the quiet heartbeat of Allied operations in the Pacific. The early warning systems installed on American ships and island stations could now detect aircraft hundreds of miles away, even through cloud and darkness. It was technology that turned the vastness of the Pacific from a blind ocean into a map of moving shadows. Japan, meanwhile, was trapped in its own illusion of superiority. Its airmen believed skill and courage alone could determine victory. Its admirals still measured strength by the tonnage of ships and the bravery of crews, not by invisible waves pulsing through the air. The Imperial Navy had seen radar demonstrated before the war, but underestimated it. Japan's engineers had their own radar programs, but they were fragmented, underfunded, and constantly overshadowed by aircraft production needs. In the eyes of Tokyo's war planners, radar was a curiosity, not a weapon. By 1943, that oversight became fatal. At Guadalcanal, American radar-directed anti-aircraft fire began shredding Japanese bombers before they reached their targets. At Midway, code-breaking and reconnaissance had already hinted that information, not numbers, would decide battles. Now, radar extended that advantage from the ocean's surface to the sky itself. The Japanese could not see the wall closing in. A network of detection stations stretching from Hawaii to the Solomons, from the Marianas to New Guinea. Each station fed information back to operations rooms where young American sailors, hunched over scopes, could watch enemy raids approach in real time. To Japan's pilots, it felt like luck, as if the Americans somehow knew where they'd be. But it wasn't luck. It was science, organization, and adaptation. Radar turned every Allied carrier group into a floating fortress. Every island base became a pair of electronic eyes. And slowly, invisibly, the Pacific tilted toward America. What had begun as a war of courage and distance was becoming a war of signals and timing. The Japanese still believed in the spirit of the warrior. The Americans had begun to trust the power of the wave, the radio wave. By late 1943, the results were clear. Japan's air groups were shrinking faster than they could be replaced. Experienced pilots were dying, fuel supplies dwindled, and the once proud formations of the Kido Butai, the mighty carrier fleet, were thinning into scattered remnants. Yet still, they fought, flying into storms of gunfire, clinging to the idea that discipline and sacrifice could overcome machines. But somewhere, deep inside the Imperial Navy's command, a few officers began to understand the truth. The war they were fighting no longer depended on who flew better, but on who could see first. And soon, the Pacific would teach that lesson in brutal, unmistakable clarity. By early 1944, the Pacific Ocean, once a vast and open battleground, had changed. Invisible lines now stretched across its horizon. They were not drawn by ships or soldiers, but by pulses of electricity bouncing off the air. Radar. On every newly captured island, the U.S. Navy's Seabees and Army Signal Corps built them. Radar stations hidden under camouflage nets, their spinning antennas scanning the heavens in the Aleutians. On Midway, on the Ui, Gilberts, on the Marshalls, on the Marianas, each installation extended America's vision farther, west, link by link, until the Pacific was threaded with electronic eyes. The system was not perfect. Tropical rain distorted signals. Power failures were common. But with every island taken, the network grew more complete. Each new radar could see farther, react faster, warn earlier. The radar wall, as it would later be called, became the silent guardian of the Allied advance. For Japanese pilots, the change was mysterious and terrifying. Throughout 1942 and 1943, they had attacked at dawn, slipping low beneath the clouds, using darkness and surprise to evade detection. But now, American fighters were in the air before they arrived. Bombers were met by flak that tracked their altitude precisely. It felt as though the Americans could sense them coming before a single engine had broken the silence. Reports began filtering back to Tokyo. Enemy intercepts us at impossible distances. Our formations are detected even in cloud cover. Night attacks no longer successful. At first, Imperial Navy headquarters dismissed the reports. They blamed traitors, loose radio chatter, or bad luck. But it wasn't luck. It was the SCR-270 and the SG radar, American engineering marvels that changed how war was fought. The same technology that had given a brief warning at Pearl Harbor now guided fleets, coordinated defenses, and tracked enemy air raids in real time. Radar operators became a new kind of soldier. Unseen, unheard, but vital, they were the sentinels who could look beyond the human eye. Each green blip on their circular screens represented hundreds of lives and millions of dollars in machinery moving through the night sky. For the first time in military history, the outcome of a battle could be altered by an electrical echo. And the Japanese? They had radar too, but late, primitive, and rare. Their Type 2. Mark II Model 1 sets were bulky, short-ranged, and plagued with reliability issues. Japan's wartime industry lacked the raw materials, copper, aluminum, vacuum tubes, to mass-produce advanced electronics. Even when their scientists developed effective prototypes, they could not replicate them in quantity. So Japan's pilots went blind into a war that demanded sight. By mid-1944, as American carrier task forces approached the Marianas, the contrast was absolute. U.S. fleets moved with precision and coordination, guided by radar control. Night fighters could now launch from carriers, track incoming raids, and shoot down attackers guided entirely by radar vectors. Japanese air crews, flying the same routes and altitudes they always had, were suddenly hunted from the darkness. The Pacific was no longer a vast ocean of chance encounters. It had become a grid, mapped, monitored, and defended by invisible power. For Japan's Zero pilots, who had once ruled the air through instinct and training, it was a nightmare they couldn't explain. Each mission felt like flying into a trap. Their surprise was gone. Their invincibility was gone, and soon, even their hope began to vanish. Still, they kept flying, because the alternative was surrender, a word forbidden in their code. But the walls around them were closing fast, built not from concrete or steel, but from electromagnetic waves. In the coming months, those walls would prove unbreakable. And at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history, Japan's finest pilots would crash headlong into that invisible frontier. Onida 20, a tiny coral island in the Central Pacific. A young radar operator named Thomas Reeves watched a glowing screen flicker in the darkness. Each sweep of the phosphor trace represented 6 seconds. 6 seconds to spot the next attack, before it reached the fleet. He was not holding a gun, nor flying a plane. Yet, in many ways, he was fighting the same battle. For hours he sat in silence, headphones on, marking blips with a grease pencil as they drifted across his scope. When the dots appeared too close, he lifted a microphone and said just 4 words: "Bogey, bearing 280. Moments later, somewhere in the sky above, American Hellcats would turn toward the signal, engines roaring into the night. This was the new rhythm of war. One fought not with eyes, but with echoes. These young radar operators were the unseen guardians of the fleet. Many were barely 20 years old, trained in secret programs that compressed months of electrical theory into weeks of instruction. Their work demanded absolute concentration. One error could mean hundreds of men caught sleeping under a surprise air raid, and on the other side of the ocean, Japanese pilots were experiencing the same war, but from the opposite end of that glowing radar pulse. They called it the eye of the American fleet. During reconnaissance flights, they would dive low, change altitude, and even shut down engines to mask their approach. But the Americans were always ready. It seemed supernatural, as if the sea itself whispered warnings to the U.S. ships. To the Japanese aviators, trained in the Bushido code of courage and sacrifice, this invisible enemy felt dishonorable. A pilot could fight another pilot. But how could one fight an unseen beam of energy? Still, they refused to yield. Even as detection grew inevitable, they tried to adapt, flying at treetop level, using weather fronts for cover, attacking at night. But radar had stripped away the fog of war. For the first time, technology had replaced intuition, and that realization marked the beginning of the end for Japan's warrior airmen. Radar was more than a warning system. It was a command revolution. Before radar, fleet commanders relied on scouts, lookouts, and luck. Battles like Coral Sea and Midway had shown the limits of visibility. Once contact was lost, chaos often followed. But now, radar created something entirely new: coordinated warfare across vast distances. American carriers could now track enemy aircraft 100 to 150 miles away. They could vector fighters to intercept at ideal altitudes, conserving fuel and maximizing kill ratios. It meant fewer wasted sorties, fewer surprises, and a level of battlefield control Japan simply could not match. The Combat Information Center, CIC, became the heart of every ship. Inside, Officers studied radar plots, radio reports, and flight data, turning waves of light into decisive orders. Aerial combat had become a system, one of data, timing, and coordination. The results were devastating. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, this advantage reached its peak. Radar picked up incoming Japanese waves hundreds of miles away. By the time they neared the American carriers, over 300 Hellcats were already airborne. The Japanese, flying outdated Zeros and poorly trained replacements, never stood a chance. The sky turned into what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most before they could even see their targets, and the reason wasn't better eyesight. It was radar. Behind every successful interception was a technician staring at a green screen, his calm voice guiding squadrons toward unseen enemies. For every pilot who claimed a kill, there was a nameless sailor in a darkened room who had made it possible. This was warfare's transformation, the birth of the electronic battlefield. Japan had entered the war with world-class pilots, but by 1943, it was losing the technology race, while American universities, led by MIT's radiation laboratory, were perfecting microwave radar using magnetron tubes. Japan's scientists were forced to improvise. They lacked industrial scale, production of precision electronics, and the resources to build large research networks. Even when Japan captured British radar units in Singapore and copied their designs, they could not match the reliability or miniaturization of Allied sets. Japanese aircraft radar, like the Type 3Q Mark VI, had ranges of barely 20 miles, useless for large-scale coordination. Meanwhile, American SG radar could detect ships at 15 to 20 nautical miles with pinpoint accuracy, and CXAM air search systems could track formations far beyond visual range. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried to compensate with tactics. They began to emphasize kamikaze operations, night attacks, and deception. But radar was indifferent to courage. A man flying by faith alone could not escape an electronic echo. Even when Japan introduced radar countermeasures, chaff, low-altitude routes, or jamming, it was too late. The American network had grown too wide, too integrated, too sophisticated, and when Japanese engineers finally began building more advanced systems, their factories were being bombed nightly by B-29s, guided, once again, by radar by 1945. Japan's military leaders understood what their pilots had known for months. The Pacific War was no longer a duel of men and machines. It had become a duel between light and shadow, between those who could see and those who could not. The final months of 1944 would turn this imbalance into catastrophe. The Japanese air arm, once the pride of the empire, would be shredded by radar-directed American fire. And as the Philippines came into view, the radar wall would become a death trap for those who dared to cross it. In Tokyo, deep within the naval headquarters at the Imperial Palace, the situation maps were beginning to tell a grim story. Blue markers, representing Allied task forces, were advancing east to west, step by step. Each week, another island fortress was lost. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who succeeded Koga after his fatal crash in 1944, studied the reports in silence. The enemy seemed to know every move before it happened. Fleet communications were intercepted, convoys ambushed, air raids predicted. Intelligence officers whispered of American machines that see through the night. At first, the High Command dismissed radar as a marginal tool, useful, perhaps, for navigation, but by mid-1944, even the most loyal staff officers could not deny its power. Carrier strikes that once relied on surprise were now annihilated, hundreds of miles from target zones. The AMIDC, U.S. Navy had achieved something far beyond conventional reconnaissance. It had achieved awareness. Toyota faced an impossible choice. He could disperse his fleets to confuse the Americans, but doing so would isolate his carriers and weaken their combined strength. Or he could mass his forces for one decisive engagement and risk total destruction under the gaze of radar-guided bombers. In October 1944, he chose the latter. Operation Shogo, the last great Japanese naval counterattack, would test whether faith and courage could overcome science. It would also reveal that radar had changed warfare forever. When the battle began, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese fleets fought with valor, but radar told the Americans everything they needed to know: where the enemy was, how fast it was moving, and when it would strike. The largest naval battle in human history ended not with equal firepower, but with one side fighting blind. Radar had given America a decisive advantage, but it also raised a haunting question. What happens when war becomes less about human bravery and more about technological superiority? For centuries, combat was governed by proximity. Men saw the faces of those they killed. Now, victory came from flickering screens and invisible pulses. For many U.S. sailors, the detachment was unsettling. They were no longer just defending, they were anticipating, striking enemies they could not see, who often never even knew they'd been detected. Some officers saw this as progress, others as moral erosion. War, one Pacific Fleet chaplain wrote in 1945, is no longer a contest of courage, but of circuitry. And yet, amid the moral unease, radar saved lives. Thousands of sailors survived attacks that would have otherwise taken them by surprise. Convoys that once suffered devastating night raids now crossed the Pacific safely. The radar operator, anonymous, unseen, had become the war's silent humanitarian. Japan's perspective was darker. For their pilots, radar was the death of honor. The kamikaze program emerged partly from this despair, a reaction to the feeling of invisibility, of being hunted by an unseen enemy. If a pilot could not strike unseen, he could still sacrifice himself openly to reclaim a sense of purpose stripped away by technology. Thus, radar did not just change tactics, it changed the soul of warfare itself. By late 1944, Japanese pilots returning from missions spoke of an overwhelming presence in the skies. Before we even saw them, one survivor of the 343rd Naval Air Group said, "They were upon us." For veteran aviators trained in maneuver combat, the experience was shattering. Dogfighting had once been an art: speed, intuition, precision. But radar interception removed the first two steps. The Americans knew the exact altitude, direction, and approach speed of their targets. It was as if fate itself had chosen their victims before they entered the battlefield. In mess halls across Japan's remaining bases, pilots stared silently into teacups, whispering rumors. Radar on every ship. Eyes even in the clouds. They felt the weight of inevitability. American aircraft carriers now launched night patrols guided by shipborne radar, using new F-6F-5N Hellcats, equipped with airborne radar sets. Even darkness, once Japan's ally, betrayed them. Nowhere felt safe for the Japanese command. Morale became impossible to sustain. Training new pilots required months, but most would die on their first or second mission. The Pacific sky had become a radar grid, and Japan's airmen were caught inside it. Those who survived spoke later of a single emotion: awe. Not of fear, nor hatred, but of recognition. They realized they had witnessed the end of an era, the moment when man's instincts were finally outmatched by his inventions. The invisible beams that pierced the Pacific had reshaped warfare, leadership, and even morality. But their true power would be revealed soon. Not in defense, but in offense, because by 1945, radar was no longer just protecting the American fleet. It was guiding a new weapon, one that would strike deep into Japan itself. By the summer of 1944, radar had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a defensive warning. It had become the nervous system of the American war machine. From the Marianas to Okinawa, every move, every interception, every bomb drop was now timed to a signal invisible to the human eye. The transformation began with the liberation of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. When U.S. forces captured these islands, they did more than claim new territory. They created floating radar outposts on land. From these positions, radar nets stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific. Each station linked by radio, each sweep of the antenna feeding information into a growing lattice of awareness. For the Japanese High Command, this was a nightmare realized. Their air routes were now exposed, their remaining bases mapped, their night attacks intercepted before they began. The Imperial Navy's scattered remnants could no longer hide in the dark. It was here, on Tinian, that the radar revolution met its most destructive weapon, the B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was a marvel of engineering. 4 engines, pressurized cabins, a range of over 3,000 miles. But what made it truly formidable wasn't its size. It was its radar-controlled bombing system. In late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces began fitting their bombers with AN/APQ-13 radar, a microwave set capable of mapping coastlines, cities, and even bridges through cloud and darkness. Suddenly, weather, once Japan's best defense, no longer mattered. Bombers could strike accurately. Day or night, on November 24, 1944, Tokyo heard its first sirens in nearly 2 years. A formation of B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing approached from the north, guided by radar alone. Japanese spotters never saw them coming. Their city's fate was now in the hands of electronics. The initial raids were high-altitude, daylight attacks. They caused damage but lacked precision. Then, in March 1945, under General Curtis LeMay, tactics changed. The bombers flew low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying incendiaries instead of explosives. Radar guided them through smoke and darkness to the heart of Tokyo. Tenfikul. Result was apocalypse. In one night, over 100,000 civilians were killed, and 16 square miles of the city burned. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, surpassing even the atomic bombings that would follow. And all of it was made possible by radar, the unseen hand guiding bombers through black, smoke, and shifting winds. At sea, the transformation was equally profound. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, operating off the Japanese coast, now fought with near-omniscient coordination. Radar picket ships formed a ring around the fleet, creating what sailors called the Wall. Nothing crossed it unseen. During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, radar warning stations detected kamikaze formations hundreds of miles away. Fighter direction officers would scramble interceptors, vectoring them by bearing and altitude until contact was made. Each interception saved hundreds of lives, yet the cost remained terrible. Takshu, Japanese pilots knew they were flying into death. They could hear the intercept calls on American frequencies, sometimes seconds before impact. Some attempted to dive below radar coverage, skimming waves so low that their propellers struck the sea spray. But even there, destroyer-mounted fire control radars tracked them relentlessly. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, nearly 1,500 kamikaze aircraft had been destroyed, most before reaching their targets. It was a massacre conducted by mathematics and magnetrons. The Pacific had become an electronic cage. Every plane that entered it left an echo, and in war, an echo was as deadly as a bullet. By July 1945, Japan's skies belonged entirely to the Allies. Radar-guided bombing, radar-assisted navigation, radar-directed interception, all had merged into one system of total control. In the ruined offices of the Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers still tried to analyze American tactics, but every report ended the same way. Our enemy sees all. The irony was profound. Japan, the empire that once struck unseen at Pearl Harbor, was now being defeated by a weapon of sight. From the hum of a radar dish on Saipan to the glowing scopes aboard the B-29. Enola Gay, the war had entered its final phase, where destruction could be plotted in coordinates, not courage. The invisible waves that crossed the Pacific now pointed toward Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. Before dawn broke over the island of Tinian, a single B-29 superfortress sat on the runway under strict radio silence. Its name, Enola Gay. Its mission, unlike any in human history. At WW2 45 hours, the aircraft lifted off, guided not by starlight or celestial navigation, but by radar beacons positioned across the Mariana Islands. Each station transmitted coded pulses, ensuring that the bomber's course would remain precise despite cloud and crosswind. Radar had become the invisible guide that carried humanity into the atomic age. As Enola Gay approached the coast of Japan, radar operators aboard confirmed their fix using the AN/APQ-13 radar, the same system used in the firebombing of Tokyo. Through that glowing cathode screen, they could see the contours of Hiroshima's delta, even beneath the morning haze. At 08:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. Radar altimeter data confirmed altitude, 31,000 feet. Then, for 43 seconds, gravity took over. When the atomic flash consumed Hiroshima, it was not just a city that vanished. It was the entire notion of war as mankind had known it. Radar had guided the mission with surgical precision. Science, once meant to protect, had now delivered annihilation. In the days that followed, Japan's ability to communicate disintegrated. Radar installations that once defended the coasts were destroyed or abandoned. Airfields lay silent, fuel supplies exhausted. The skies above the homeland were empty, except for the sound of American bombers circling in perfect formation. Guided by signals, Japan could neither jam nor escape. Even the Imperial Palace in Tokyo had come under the gaze of radar-equipped reconnaissance planes. To the Japanese command, it felt as though their very thoughts were being read from above. After the second atomic bombing on August 9th, at Nagasaki, the Imperial General, headquarters received reports that American aircraft were being tracked on radar, but not attacked. No fighters, scrambled, no anti-aircraft. Guns fired. The nation had lost not only its weapons but its will. Admiral Toyoda, whose fleets had once ruled the Pacific, now faced a simple truth. The empire was blind, and blindness in war was death. The last broadcast, on August 14, 1945, a faint transmission was detected by U.S. monitoring stations on Guam. It was a coded signal, sent from Tokyo, the last active communication from the Japanese government. Its purpose, to request a ceasefire. What's rarely told is that this message, too, was confirmed and authenticated using radar triangulation. American technicians, scanning frequencies and echo returns, verified the signal's origin within minutes. Technology had closed every gap, from the open ocean to the airwaves themselves. The next day, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation by radio, a speech that would be remembered as the Jewel Voice broadcast. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice, and fittingly, his surrender was carried across the same invisible spectrum that had doomed the empire. The airwaves, the unseen frequencies, the invisible hum of modern war. As Japan surrendered, the radar stations that had once pulsed day and night across the Pacific began to shut down one by one. Operators removed their headphones, logged their final readings, and powered down the generators. The screens went dark. The silence was almost unbearable. For 3 years, these glowing circles of light had determined life and death. Now, their purpose was fulfilled. On the island of Guam, one young radar officer later recalled, "When the war ended, I looked at the screen and saw nothing. Just a straight line. No planes, no echoes. For the first time, the Pacific was empty. Radar had begun as a line of defense, evolved into a weapon, and ended as a witness, an observer to the fall of an empire. The age of electronic warfare had begun, and there was no turning back. The end of the war did not silence the hum of radar. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of vigilance, one that would define the Cold War and every conflict after it. But in the final summer of 1945, as Japan lay in ruins, the last echoes of radar faded across the Pacific, carrying with them the memories of every pilot who flew blind and every operator who saw too much. September 1945. The guns had fallen silent across the Pacific. The skies that once roared with steel and thunder now lay quiet. But beneath that silence, in laboratories, naval bases, and bombed-out cities, a new realization was spreading. The war had not been won by numbers alone. It had been won by information, by signals, by detection, by the unseen pulse of radar. In Tokyo, Allied inspection teams began to dismantle what was left of Japan's radar network. They found primitive oscillators, unfinished blueprints, and destroyed control rooms buried under ash. The technology was years behind. Japan had built courage, but America had built vision. The Pacific War had proven that the battlefield was no longer defined by distance or firepower, but by who could see first. In the months following Japan's surrender, the United States conducted a vast intelligence review known as Operation Lusty, a campaign to capture and catalog enemy technology. Among aircraft, engines, and weapons, radar stood out as the most valuable prize. American scientists had seen its power firsthand, from the early SCR-270 units that detected the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, to the airborne radars that guided bombers through storms and darkness. By 1945, the U.S. possessed over 100 radar models, covering everything from submarine detection to long-range navigation. That radar wall, invisible but impenetrable, had stretched from Hawaii to the Marianas, from Australia to Okinawa. It allowed the Allies to anticipate every Japanese movement, to intercept convoys, to time strikes with eerie precision. To Japan's surviving officers, it felt like facing a god that could see through clouds, night, and deception. The Empire's war planners admitted this openly in post-war interrogations. "We never understood how they always knew where we were." One former admiral confessed, "It was as though our every breath was seen before it left our lungs." Behind this technological triumph stood minds whose names were barely known. Outside their labs, men like Alfred Loomis, whose private radar lab in New York helped develop microwave radar systems. Luis Alvarez, who created ground-mapping radar for bombers. And Robert Watson-Watt, the Scottish engineer whose early work in the 1930s had made radar a reality. By 1945, radar research had become the single largest scientific collaboration in human history, larger even than the Manhattan Project. Over 15,000 engineers, physicists, and mathematicians had worked in secret to refine radar for air, land, and sea. They built the world's first radar-guided bombing systems, the first automatic landing radars, the first electronic countermeasures, and when the atomic bomb ended the war, these same scientists turned their gaze to peace, to civil aviation, meteorology, and communications. Radar, once the weapon that destroyed cities, would soon become the system that guided planes safely home. In Japan, the devastation was total. Over 60 cities burned, millions displaced, industry crippled. But amid the ashes, a quiet rebirth began. Former radar engineers, men once trained to detect enemies, were now assigned to rebuild communication networks, power grids, and radio systems. Their wartime experience with radio waves and electronics became the foundation of Japan's post-war miracle. By the 1950s, the very science that had failed to save the empire helped fuel its resurrection. Companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, and Sony, all of which would later become global leaders in electronics, traced their roots to wartime research in radar and communications. In a sense, radar had not only ended Japan's war, it had begun Japan's future. As the world shifted from fire to reconstruction, a new struggle began. Not for land or empire, but for technological dominance. And radar, the silent weapon of the Pacific, would now evolve into something far more powerful: the birth of modern electronic warfare. When World War II ended, the world didn't return to peace. It merely entered a quieter form of warfare. A war of observation, interception, and anticipation. Radar, once the hidden guardian of Pacific skies, became the backbone of a new kind of global security. The Americans had learned an essential truth. Whoever controlled the electromagnetic spectrum controlled the future. They expanded radar technology into a vast network that spanned the globe. By 1946, radar stations encircled the Northern Hemisphere, from Alaska to Greenland, from Britain to Japan. It was no longer just about detecting aircraft. It was about watching the world. The radar wall that had once stopped Japanese raids was reborn as the WW line. The distant early warning system, chain of stations that guarded against a new kind of threat. Soviet bombers carrying nuclear weapons. Radar had become civilization's nervous system, a web of signals, constantly scanning for danger. World War II, once it was fortifying had taught militaries that radar could not only defend but deceive. During the final months of the war, American and British engineers had already experimented with radar jamming, spoofing, and decoy signals. What began as improvisation turned into doctrine. By the early 1950s, a new field had emerged: electronic warfare, EW. Radars no longer just watched the skies. They guided missiles, tracked submarines, and identified friend from foe. Every major power invested billions into radar, countermeasures from stealth coatings to electronic noise. Clouds that blinded enemy detection, T1T, quiet duels of the Pacific. Those unseen battles of pulse and echo had evolved into a new global chess match. Every nation now fought not just for territory, but for invisibility. In the years that followed, radar found a new purpose, one that touched every civilian life. The same radar that guided bombers through darkness now guided aircraft safely through storms. Airport control towers adopted radar. Navigation, weather scientists used it to track hurricanes. Mariners relied on it to steer through fog and night. The invisible wall of war had become a shield for peace. By the 1960s, radar technology helped launch the space race. NASA engineers adapted military radar to track rockets, monitor satellites, and even map the surface of Venus. What had once seen enemy bombers now looked toward the stars. In Japan, radar scientists turned their wartime expertise into peacetime innovation. They pioneered transistor-based electronics, advanced broadcasting, and microwave communications. Companies born from these post-war labs would transform Japan into a technological superpower within a generation. It was one of history's greatest ironies that the very technology which had signaled Japan's defeat became the foundation of its rebirth. Today, the Pacific skies are filled with satellites, drones, and radar-guided systems so advanced they can detect an object the size of a bird hundreds of miles away. Yet the principles remain unchanged. Pulses of energy, echoes returning, a constant search for the unseen. The radar wall that Japanese pilots once feared still exists, though now it circles the globe, watching for nuclear launches, tracking space debris, and safeguarding civilian flights. In that sense, the Pacific War never truly ended. Its lessons still hum within every radar screen, every airport tower, every military base. The invisible weapon that once turned the tide of history now watches silently over humanity. Proof that in war, the most powerful victories are not seen, but sensed. The hum of radar continues, faint but eternal, a reminder that the line between safety and destruction is drawn not by walls of steel, but by waves of light. In the end, the war in the Pacific was not just a clash of empires. It was a collision between vision and blindness, between those who could see the unseen and those who still trusted only their eyes. For the Japanese pilots who faced America's radar wall, the realization came too late. They had mastered courage, precision, and sacrifice, but they were flying into a world where courage alone was no longer enough. The future of war would belong not to the boldest, but to the most perceptive. Radar had changed more than the course of battle. It had changed the very definition of power. It proved that victory no longer depended on who struck first, but on who knew first. That invisible sweep of light across a screen symbolized something far greater than technology. It was a new way of understanding reality. That knowledge, even if unseen, could shape destiny. Every pilot who vanished into the Pacific, every operator who sat in a dark radar room tracing those faint echoes, they were part of a transformation that would redefine the human age. From the cold skies of the Philippine Sea to the silent halls of Space Command. Centers decades later, the pulse of radar continues. Steady, unbroken. It watches, warns, and remembers. And as long as humanity continues to look into the distance, to scan horizons, to predict storms, to prepare for what cannot yet be seen, the spirit of that radar wall lives on. A symbol of foresight, a monument to human ingenuity, and a quiet reminder that even in war, the most powerful force is not destruction, but awareness.